Welcome back. You are watching K24 Weekend Edition with me, Michelle Morgan. It is now time for our lifestyle interview. And today we are discussing toxic people in the workplace and how to deal with them. Now in studio to discuss this a little bit further is John Achokah, who is a business consultant with Blue Sky Africa. Thank you very much for being here in studio to discuss toxic people. Let's first begin by describing or defining what the characteristics of a toxic person are.
Well, a toxic personnel is someone who really doesn't necessarily cooperate with the other employees, number one. Someone who's very difficult in terms of performing tasks. They can show that through tardiness, not coming to work on time, and sometimes it's just the morale is not there. So the concentration with work and whatever they're doing, you find that it's really minimal. And this really brings out some type of negativity in their demeanor. And that kind of shows really, and it could really pass on to other people, and that's why it becomes toxic.
Okay, so tell me about your experience with a Blue Strategy Africa. Is this quite common that you come across toxic people when you consult for Blue Sky, or is it common within the workplace to come across toxic people?
Yes, it is. It's common than we actually imagine. Gallup did almost like a survey worldwide. There's only 13% of employees who are engaged. And that really is very, very...
13%?
13%. So which it means 87% of employees are either non-engaged or totally disengaged. And that really is a big concern.
Okay, all right. So why is it so common if you're saying that it's nearly 83% of people who are not engaged, some of this attributed to toxic people within the workplace? Why is it so common? Is it due to differences in people, differences in background, in values or beliefs? Or what would you attribute this commonality to?
Well, a number of things I can attribute to it. First of all, basically what we do is, I'll call it human files, where you think about things that from the past experiences, facts, upbringing, and things like that. They affect you in how you look at things. And obviously, either you could be someone who's cooperating with others, or you could just be a difficult person. But that's really something that can be switched around. And this, I can say, we help organizations to look at what we call thinking outside the box. And that's one area that we try to help. And on the other side, it's more of really leadership, where there's a big gap between the employees and the leadership. So
it's often the dynamic in which employees exist that can create these dynamics.
Absolutely.
Okay, but I'm curious to understand a little bit further what the catalyst to some of these commonalities of office conflict is. Why is it so common?
Well, it's common because it's what I would call a drift. You know what a drift is? It's almost like swept by the current. What happens is when you're coming into the organization, for example, as a new employee, whatever you hear around you, for example, if people start talking negatively about the specific leader or manager, or just the environment in general, it kind of sticks in your head, and subconsciously you start adapting to that. So that becomes really, it affects you in the way you relate to others, and just your general understanding of the environment doesn't become conducive because of what you hear. Because a lot of times what we say is made up, either assessments or observations. And it kind of brings into a point where if I tell you something, however, if it's negative, it comes out subconsciously in your psyche, and you start practicing that. And you say, this place is bad, and word of mouth. And it just...
Okay. So from your experience, what are some examples of toxic people that you've personally dealt with in your consulting experience?
Well, you have employees who are clearly not interested at all. Like I say, the numbers show that most of the employees are not engaged at all. And most organizations put in strategies which they need to implement. But what happens is that the gap between the leadership and lack of ownership and commitment from employees, because it's almost like this company belongs to the CEO and all the other people. I'm just here to do the job. And that really brings out that.
So disengagement is a core factor.
It's a core factor.
Again, I'm curious to hear from you some examples of toxic situations which create conflict. From your experience, has this been gender specific, for example, between two females? Is that more common? Or is it authoritative based, maybe someone on a power trip?
Well, obviously there's the issue about people really not, for example, if you have a manager who's a female or an employee who's been around for a long time and a younger person comes in and becomes their boss, for example, that brings out some resentment as well. You have issues where people just don't feel comfortable to be led by a woman, which is very often seen in the workplace. Or just the way you lead, because people usually don't leave organizations, they leave supervisors and managers, and that really brings that toxicity. Or there could be also some emotional issues around the employees as well when they're battling with something outside the workplace.
And then actually reflecting it in their interactions with people at work. So what are some of the effects of this toxic environment, be it toxic people, if you encounter them on a daily basis, obviously going to work, this is a big part of your routine and lifestyle. Right. What are some of the effects that this can have on an individual?
Well, obviously it lowers down their morale. Number one, it not only affects the individual who is toxic, but the people around him. Because what happens is that every time you look at leadership, it's talked about teamwork, working together, but people don't really, it kind of disengages that cooperation and performing the tasks. And that really is the biggest challenge that we'll see out there. So that, I think when you look at it generally, you find that it's a bigger problem, but individually, people are definitely they just come in, I'm here to get paid, and that's it. But
what is the effect of that, of being demoralized, of coming in and interacting with toxic people? What effect will that have on an individual's well-being, for example?
Well, it's very interesting you ask that, because obviously the lack of interpersonal relationship, people become subdued. They're disinterested, they are low performers, and generally you find that it affects the productivity as well.
Okay, that's an interesting point, because I was going to ask you about the effects on an organization, and you just mentioned productivity. Would you like to elaborate?
Yes. You know, what happens is, let's just give an example where you have senior management sit together and formulate the strategy for the organization, really where the vision, the organization is going. The expectation is that the implementation is going to be done by lower level employees or frontline managers, for instance. What happens is that it creates a big disconnect, because if we are looking to achieve our goals as an organization, for instance, we would have to depend on our personnel to execute. So for us to get there. But if there is negative vibe, you find that productivity is low, and hence the revenue is also affected as well.
Okay, so what not to do in a situation? Let's begin by discussing, if you are an employee, if you're working within an organization and you find yourself in a toxic environment, let's say encountering people who don't have very good vibes, very good energy, what should you not do?
Well, you should not criticize, for one. I think the biggest thing is try to understand them. Most of the time, people lash out when it's in the open.
It's easier said than done to maintain zen and maybe not react to somebody who is clearly being very abrasive and maybe actually wanting you to being very provocative, is what I'm trying to say.
Well, obviously, you have to get to the bottom of it. The biggest challenge is people don't necessarily, you become emotional. And you don't necessarily try to address the issue.
So you're saying don't act on emotion?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But that's so much easier said than done.
Well, there's a difference between being professional and being emotionally unstable. When people throw the professional word around, it just means that you put yourself in a situation where...
What if somebody is really provoking you and, you know, saying things that they know are going to get under your skin and you can feel yourself bubbling up? What are perhaps methods in which you can control your temper or not act on your emotions?
Well, obviously, you have to have some emotional intelligence, you know, and that's easy than stuff. And obviously, it's easier said than done, but obviously, once you do understand the fundamentals, for example, if you lash out, there has to be something. There's a bottom line. There's something that is causing you to lash out.
Yes, but maybe there are methods that you might be able to outline in which people can utilize if they find themselves actually rising to the bait of somebody provoking them. What can they do not to?
Well, number one, I think it's just to make sure that when you look at the organization, people are resenting something. There's something that is causing them to resent. What I would think is what you use by showing people is to actually use breakthrough thinking, which you think outside the box.
Okay.
Yeah, you think outside the box and don't do the norm. A lot of times we find that leadership training, I'm not sure if you're familiar with 1 Minute Manager, you catch people doing something right. You cannot keep reprimanding somebody who is a non-performer. But sometimes it just takes a little bit of trying to find them doing something right to be able to get them to change the way they look at things. And that probably can be able to bring them to the straight line to be able to perform. And that really has happened. Study has shown that most people really have something that is underlying their resentment, and that causes a lot of toxicity, if there's such a word. And I think it's interesting for people to understand that building that interpersonal relationship, which most people lack, it's important.
Okay, so you've described what not to do.
Yes.
Now let's discuss what you should do. Say you find yourself encountering a toxic person, somebody who's very abrasive, someone who's combative, somebody who's intentionally trying to get under your skin. In your workplace, which is a predominant part of your daily routine, you're saying utilize emotional intelligence, maybe you don't rise to the bait, but what should you do? What is the best way to handle a toxic person in the workplace?
Well, let me give you an example. There's an employee who everybody knows that you don't play with them because they lash out, they're toxic, and sometimes it gets into them. They believe it. The best thing is to try to do a one-on-one. If you're a supervisor, for instance, you have to do a one-on-one for an individual. Make sure you be there for them. When I say be there for them, and listen out to them. Let them know that it's...
So you're saying as an employer?
Yes.
Effectively babysitting an employee who maybe feels targeted? Is that what you're saying?
Well, it's not necessarily babysitting. Mm-hmm. It's just basically making them to understand that they belong. There's a sense of belonging. And if a lot of times the resentment comes from people not feeling that they belong.
So I think it creates this murky environment where, you want to create a comfortable environment, but you don't want to be too harsh. Where do you draw the line in that regard?
But the bottom line, you have to remember that people usually are our biggest assets in the organization. So you have to find ways to make everyone comfortable. At some point, you would have to make a decision if that person doesn't belong there. But before you do that, you have to give them an opportunity to actually understand, do they necessarily have something that can be resolved to bring them on board? You have to treat them as your customer. If you look at, in most cases, you find that if you're selling a product, and the customer is always right because they bring in the revenue. What most people don't understand is that the people actually are the ones that drive that revenue within the organization. You have to treat them as your customers. Okay,
so from the point of view of an organization, yes, who might find that they've got two people who don't get along, two personalities that are conflictive towards one another. Yes. What should an organization do if they have two valuable employees who should be working together but are not?
Well, I would say that you use something we call the situation leadership. What situation leadership does is to identify the strengths of an individual and capitalize on that. A lot of times we give tasks and we delegate tasks to individuals who are not necessarily interested in doing the job, or maybe they need some guidance and coaching. You have to really draw the line and know where should you help and what are the strengths of an individual as well.
Okay, all right, fantastic. So you've given us a good outlook on how to react to the situation if you're the employee, yes, as well as the employer. Do you have any final words?
Well, I think the biggest challenge that we have, like we've seen, a lot of organizations do not necessarily understand how to get the disengaged employees to become disengaged, to become engaged, for example. So in sub-Saharan Africa, 2012, it was only 10% of engaged employees, which means 90% I think the best thing that you have to do is to make sure that you find ways and understand that we can treat them as customers and bring them to be engaged. That way, you have a healthy organization which is now bringing more energy from its employees and the potentials that are not tapped. And I think that would also reflect in your revenue as well.
Okay, all right. Well, there we have it. Thank you very much, James, for coming into John, rather, my apologies,
Yes.
to discuss office politics and toxic people within the workplace. Thank you very
Thanks
much
for
for being
having me.
here and
Thank you very
sharing
much.
your views on the issue.
Thank you.
So that wraps up our lifestyle interview for this evening.